Story 1. What lives in the land between the lakes. In 1993, my hunting partner and I planned a weekend hunting trip in the land between the lakes. As its name implies, the land between the lakes is a strip of deep forest between two lakes in southern Kentucky, just north of the Tennessee border. We were looking forward to a couple of days of relaxation, camaraderie, and hopefully, a successful hunt. Little did we know, though, that our excursion would turn into a terrifying ordeal that still haunts me to this day. We arrived early on a Friday, set up camp, and spent the day preparing everything we needed for the weekend. As night approached, we sat by the fire, talked, and planned out our hunts for the weekend. When early morning came, we decided to split up to cover more ground. I ventured deeper into the woods, while my partner stayed closer to camp. After walking for quite a while, I found a nice tree to lean my back up against and scanned the woods for sound and movement. Hours went by, and all I saw was a few squirrels chasing each other around and rummaging through the forest. While I didn't see any deer that day, I still got to enjoy the sounds and beauty of nature. As I made my way back to camp, though, things took a turn. With nightfall creeping in, I felt an unnerving sensation of being watched. I could hear twigs snapping just out of the reach of my vision, and leaves rustling in the distance. I quickened my pace and tried to dismiss the unease that I felt, but at the same time, I'd been in the woods many times and never felt this way. My anxiety only intensified when I heard heavy footsteps paralleling my path. They were too deliberate, too rhythmic for any animal I knew. It sounded, too, like whatever it was on 2 feet. I stopped and tried to look through the dense underbrush, but it was getting dark, and I couldn't see anything. When I stopped, the footsteps stopped as well, and a chilling realization hit me. Whatever was out there was intelligent, and it seemed to be stalking me. The only thing that I thought it could have been was a person. I called out, asking who was there, but got no response. Finally, I couldn't contain the tension inside me any longer, and I broke out into a run, my heart pounding in my chest. As I neared the camp, the footsteps faded into the background. I burst into the clearing, gasping for breath, and found my partner pacing around the fire. His eyes were wide, and he scanned around the surrounding woodline, ignoring me like I wasn't even there. I told him about my experience, expecting him to laugh it off, but he was fixated on the woods and said nothing. "Hey," I finally said. "Did you hear me? I said somebody was stalking me on the way in." He finally snapped out of his trance and looked over at me, his eyes still wide and showing a hint of terror. "Someone followed me too," he said, "but I don't think it was a person." We decided to stay alert through the night, taking turns keeping watch. As the fire died down to embers, my partner nudged me awake for my shift. The woods were eerily silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy and oppressive. That silence, however, didn't last. As my partner dozed off to sleep, a low guttural growl pierced through the night from the edge of the campsite. I grabbed my rifle, my eyes straining in the darkness. As I scanned back and forth across the trees, I finally caught a glimpse of movement. There in the distance was the unmistakable head of a dog, lurking just behind a tree. It was enormous, and its eyes seemed to almost glow in the dark. For a moment it was motionless, just staring at us from the distance. But what it did next would give me nightmares for the rest of my life. A sudden cracking sound reverberated through the woods. It was so loud that it woke my partner. The best way to describe it was like the sound of knuckles being cracked into a microphone. As it made these noises, its head rose higher and higher until it seemed like it was floating almost 7 to 8 feet up in the air. By this time, both me and my partner were just staring at it, completely paralyzed with fear. It wasn't done, though. As we gazed upon it, it finally stepped out from behind one tree and slowly made its way behind another tree, never taking its gaze off of us. It did this, on 2 legs. "Did you see that?" my hunting partner asked, his voice trembling. "That thing is on 2 feet." I'll never forget that moment and what I saw. It had the head of a dog, torso of a man, but was completely covered in hair. It stood between 7 and 8 feet tall, and it had hands instead of paws. As we looked upon it, more growls came, from all directions of the woods. Suddenly, without thinking, I fired my rifle at the creature. It let out a howl that pierced the night and retreated into the darkness. My partner grabbed his gun and we both fired into the shadows where the taunting growls continued. In that moment, we deeply regretted our decision to stay the night and knew that we had to leave immediately. We needed to get to our truck right then, or we wouldn't make it until morning. Grabbing our essentials, we ran down the trail, guided only by the moonlight, to our truck, which was about a third of a mile away. As we ran, the growls followed us, a constant reminder that we were not the hunters anymore, but the hunted. As we neared the truck, the growls got closer and closer. They were all around us, yet they kept their distance, as if toying with us, thriving off of our fear. As we reached the truck, we scrambled inside, throwing everything we had with us in the back. I started it up, and as I flicked on the headlights, its beams shot into the forest, and for a brief moment, there in the distance, I saw 3 more of these creatures. While one was on all fours, the other 2 stood there, on 2 legs baring their razor-sharp teeth at us. I mashed the pedal to the floorboard and took the truck down the narrow dirt road as quickly as it could go. We made it out alive, but what we experienced that night changed us forever. We reported our encounter, but our story was met with skepticism and disbelief. People thought we were lunatics, and they looked at us like we were crazy. In the moment, we had no idea what we had run into. We would later find out, however, that there was a name for what we had encountered. People call it Dogman. Since then, I've never returned to those woods, and I've given up hunting. The memory of those glowing eyes and that feeling of being hunted still lingers in my mind. I now know there are things in this world beyond our understanding, creatures that defy explanation. I also know that some of them reside in the land between the lakes. Story 2. A terrifying encounter in Skinwalker Valley. Just to the west of the Rocky Mountains in eastern Utah lies a place with stories of the paranormal going back for generations. This sprawling region, widely referred to as Skinwalker Territory or Skinwalker Valley, carries a name that resonates with ominous undertones. I wasn't a believer in such tales, but what happened to me a few years back in that godforsaken place changed everything. I was an avid hiker, always in search of new trails and experiences. The territory, with its sprawling landscapes and eerie beauty, seemed like the perfect place for my next adventure. I had heard the stories, of course, about creatures called skinwalkers, shape-shifting beings of Native American lore. But I dismissed these as mere myths, a part of the local folklore. It was a crisp autumn day when I set out on my hike. The valley was breathtaking, with its red sandstone cliffs and golden aspens. I wandered off the beaten path, drawn by the allure of unexplored terrain. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I realized I had ventured further than intended. On my way back, I heard a sound unlike any animal I knew. It was a piercing scream, mixed with a human-like wail echoing through the valley. My initial thought was a mountain lion, but this was different, more disturbing. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickened my pace, aiming to reach the safety of my car before nightfall. As I hurried down the trail, the sound grew closer, more intense. Whatever it was, knew I was there, and seemed to be closing in on me. I felt like I was being watched, and every few feet I would glance back over my shoulder to see if there was something there, but there was nothing. Completely unnerved, my steady walk turned into a hurried trot. After about 5 or 6 minutes of trotting, something in my gut stopped me dead in my tracks. It was an overwhelming feeling of dread, right in the pit of my stomach. For some reason, I felt like whatever I was running from was close, very close. Trying to catch my breath, I slowly turned to look behind me, and that's when I finally saw it. A figure, humanoid in form but grotesquely distorted. It was gray all over, its limbs were disproportionately long, and its movements were unnatural. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dimming light, fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. For a moment it stood there, probably 75 to 80 feet away, just staring at me. And then, it did something that defied logic, and burned into my head something that I'll never forget. It dropped down to all fours and its body began to twist and contort. It made strange noises, and right before my very eyes, it took on the form of a large, twisted coyote, but with the same haunting eyes. I stumbled back, cloaked in absolute terror with what I had just witnessed. My foot caught on a root and I fell to the ground, but I was up in an instant. In that moment of sheer terror, something within me surged, a primal instinct to survive, I guess. I ran with a speed that I didn't even know that I had. This time I didn't look back, not until the lights of my car were in sight. As I stumbled into my car, I looked behind me, but there was nothing. Not wanting to stick around any longer, I hit the ignition and drove home without stopping. My body was shaking, and my mind was reeling from the encounter. The image of the creature haunted me, its initial grotesque form, and the way it had twisted and changed. After that night, the stories of skinwalkers, once myths to me, now took on a new significance. I don't hike in skinwalker territory anymore. In fact, I avoid the area at all costs. The memory of that encounter has lingered with me for a long time, and I constantly have nightmares about the time I came face to face with something unexplainable, something ancient and terrifying. Story 3. The Orb. A few years back, a small group of friends and I were deep in the woods, embarking on what was supposed to be a routine camping trip. We had found a clearing, set up our camp, and settled in for the night. Our campfire was the only source of light in the vast darkness that surrounded us. We spent the evening exchanging stories and sharing laughs, but the mood shifted abruptly when an unusual, high-pitched ringing sound pierced the night air. It was unlike anything I had ever heard, almost mechanical in nature, and it instantly drew our attention. We exchanged puzzled glances, each of us silently questioning the source of this bizarre noise. Initially, we tried to dismiss it as an anomaly, perhaps at the time, trying to put ourselves at ease. Without warning, though, the sound ceased as suddenly as it had begun, leaving us in an eerie silence. This quiet, however, was short-lived. Soon, we began to hear other noises, distant rustlings and soft, heavy thuds, suggesting the presence of something large moving in the darkness. As we debated the possible sources of these sounds, a glowing orb of light appeared in the distance. Its appearance was otherworldly, emitting a pulsating glow that seemed to hover just above the forest floor. We watched, speechless and immobile, as the orb began to move toward us, carrying the ringing sound that we had heard earlier with it. We tried to rationalize what we were seeing. Maybe it was another camper with a flashlight. Maybe somebody was flying a drone. Our rationalizations, however, disappeared when out of nowhere, it did something unexpected. In an instant, it zipped in from the distance, shot through our campsite within just a few feet from us, and then shot straight up into the air and disappeared. The silence that followed was palpable. None of us spoke for several moments, each grappling with the shock and fear of what we had just witnessed. Eventually, it was Mike who suggested we investigate the area where the orb had first appeared. Equipped with our flashlights, we ventured into the woods, following the path where the orb had appeared. The forest felt different now, almost alive with a foreboding presence. Upon reaching the spot that we believed the orb originated from, we found nothing out of the ordinary. There were no signs of the light, no footprints, and no disturbances on the ground. It was as if nothing was ever there. Just as we were about to return to camp, the rustling and heavy thuds that we had heard earlier resonated from the darkness around us. We turned frantically, our flashlights cutting through the night, but there was nothing to be seen. The thuds continued, louder and more menacing. They seemed to come from all directions, and we could feel the vibrations in the ground. In a state of panic, we ran back to our campsite, driven by primal fear. We didn't stop until we were safely within the confines of our clearing. That night, none of us slept. We stayed awake, vigilant and anxious, keeping watch over the woods that had suddenly turned hostile. At dawn, we packed our belongings and left the forest as fast as we could. To this day, I cannot rationalize what we experienced that night in the woods. The glowing orb, the unexplainable sounds, and the unsettling presence we felt remain a mystery. It was the most bizarre trip that any of us had ever been on. I've revisited the event countless times in my head, discussing it with my friends, researching phenomena, even reaching out to experts in fields I previously scoffed at. But unfortunately, no theory and no logical explanation can encompass the totality of what we experienced that night.